Beneath the shadows of towering castles and the smoke of burning pyres, the Middle Ages concealed a world far darker than the chronicles of knights and saints would ever admit. Behind the polished armor of chivalry and the solemn hymns of cathedrals lay a society consumed by fear. Fear of sin, of lust, of the body's unholy temptations. And yet, in the same breath that condemned desire, this era crafted punishments so perverse, so twisted in their cruelty, that they revealed an obsession with sexuality even more grotesque than the sins they claimed to abolish. Tonight, we journey into that darkness, into a hidden world where the line between justice and sadism blurred, and where bodies became canvases for punishment, humiliation, and spectacle. It is easy to imagine the Middle Ages as an age of simplicity, peasants tilling the land, lords ruling from their stone halls, the church guiding souls toward heaven. But human desire is not so easily erased, and when it collided with strict religious codes, it birthed a theater of cruelty unlike any other. Sexual crimes became not only a personal failing but a threat to the moral fabric of Christendom itself, and so the punishments for them had to be more than corrective. They had to be terrifying, unforgettable, and deeply symbolic. The human body became both sinner and stage, and its suffering a lesson to all who dared to watch. Consider adultery. In the eyes of medieval society, it was not merely a betrayal of trust between husband and wife, but an assault on the sacred order of inheritance and divine law. The punishment was designed to mark the guilty flesh with shame that could never be washed away. In Germany and France, women caught in adultery were sometimes forced to parade naked through the streets while the crowd jeered and hurled filth at them. Their hair might be shaved as a symbol of disgrace, their bodies painted or branded with hot irons so all would know their transgression. Men, too, suffered, but often in ways that stripped them of their very manhood. In certain towns, an adulterer could be castrated, his mutilation both vengeance and warning, while the community gathered to watch with morbid fascination. Imagine the silence of a village square as the deed was carried out, the air thick with smoke, the victim's screams echoing against stone walls, and the knowledge that this fate awaited anyone whose desire strayed. But adultery was not the only sin. Carnal acts deemed unnatural, sodomy, fornication outside wedlock, even the faintest rumor of lust, were treated with suspicion and severity. The Church's obsession with purity demanded that desire itself be criminalized, yet the punishments often mirrored the very acts they condemned, carried out with an intimacy that revealed both fear and fascination. Those accused of sodomy, particularly men, faced the most brutal consequences: public mutilations, executions by fire, or torture devices designed to violate as much as punish. The hypocrisy was striking. While condemning forbidden desires, the authorities themselves staged spectacles of the body that lingered on its most private parts. One of the most chilling punishments of the Middle Ages was reserved for women accused of promiscuity or prostitution. The so-called scold's bridle was a device of iron, fitted over the head like a grotesque mask, with a spiked plate forced into the mouth. Every word, every attempt to speak pressed the tongue against jagged metal, causing pain and blood. Though it was used to silence gossips, it found particular use in shaming women accused of sexual misconduct. Paraded through the streets, their heads encased in iron, they became living warnings of what awaited those who defied moral order. Behind their hollow eyes, one could see the horror of a punishment designed not only to hurt but to humiliate, reducing the human voice itself to a weapon turned inward. Other punishments targeted the very organs of pleasure and reproduction. In certain medieval courts, women accused of infidelity could be subjected to chastity testing, a crude and humiliating inspection of their bodies by midwives or inquisitors. These examinations, cloaked in the language of piety, were themselves violations, rituals of forced exposure and degradation. For men, devices of iron and rope threatened their genitals with crushing, burning, or mutilation, the punishment fitting not the crime, but the obsession of those who enforced it. The symbolism was stark. Desire had to be controlled, even if it meant destroying the flesh that carried it. Public shame was as important as pain. Sexual punishments were rarely carried out in secret. They were meant to be witnessed, to be remembered, to seep into the minds of villagers and linger like a warning in their dreams. A woman caught with a lover might be tied to a cart and dragged through muddy streets while onlookers spat and hurled rotten food. A man accused of lechery might be bound naked to a post, his body whipped as the crowd mocked him. The theater of punishment was as much about spectacle as it was about justice. Each scream, each scar, each act of humiliation became part of a collective memory, ensuring that fear would govern where desire dared to rise. And yet, for all their cruelty, these punishments revealed something even darker about medieval society. Its obsession with sex was as strong as its condemnation of it. The punishments lingered on the flesh, on the private parts, on acts imagined and described in painstaking detail. Trials recorded every alleged movement, every whispered encounter, every imagined position, with a precision that betrayed the fascination of those who judged. The church preached purity, but the courtrooms and torture chambers betrayed a hunger for the very sins they condemned. One cannot ignore the role of superstition. Medieval Europe believed that sexuality could invite demons, curses, or witchcraft. Women accused of lust were often tied to accusations of sorcery, their bodies said to be vessels of the devil himself. Trials of witches frequently included invasive examinations for marks of the devil, which were little more than birthmarks or scars. These examinations were carried out by men who prodded and violated under the guise of holy duty, turning justice into ritualized abuse. If the accused confessed under torture, and many did, it was often after enduring sexual humiliation as brutal as the punishments that followed. Burning at the stake was the final act, but long before the flames, the body had already been consumed by a system that fed on its suffering. The Middle Ages also crafted bizarre symbolic punishments, where the body became both lesson and metaphor. In some towns, adulterers were forced to wear strange costumes, horns on their heads, donkey ears, or even heavy wooden tablets describing their sin hung around their necks. Couples caught together could be bound naked back to back and paraded until exhaustion overcame them. These punishments transformed human shame into theater, a carnival of cruelty that blurred the line between justice and mockery. The laughter of the crowd was as much a part of the sentence as the pain itself, for ridicule could cut deeper than any blade. Even royalty was not immune. Chronicles record tales of queens and noblewomen accused of infidelity, who were threatened with confinement, mutilation, or execution, their sexuality transformed into a weapon against dynasties. A queen accused of betrayal did not just endanger her husband's honor. She threatened the legitimacy of heirs, the stability of kingdoms, the will of God himself. The punishment for such suspicion could be swift and merciless. Some were locked in towers, their bodies wasting away in silence. Others faced public shaming that stripped them of dignity before the eyes of all Christendom. Their sins, real or imagined, became weapons in political struggles, where accusations of lust could topple thrones. The twisted creativity of medieval punishments was not born of sadism alone. It was born of control. The church and state understood that to govern desire was to govern people, and so they built a system where the body was both battlefield and trophy. To touch, to lust, to love outside prescribed bonds was to invite not just personal ruin, but a public destruction that lingered long after the flesh had healed, if it healed at all. The punishments left scars on bodies, but deeper scars on societies, teaching generations to fear not only their own desires but the judgment of those who watched. And yet, beneath the cruelty one finds a strange mirror. The very acts that were punished most severely, adultery, sodomy, lust, were those most vividly imagined by the punishers themselves. The detail of their records, the intimacy of their tortures, the symbolism of their devices all reveal a society fascinated by what it claimed to despise. It is as if medieval Europe could not look away from the very sins it tried to erase, and so it carved them into flesh, burned them into memory, and displayed them for all to see. The bells of cathedrals rang to call the faithful to prayer, but just as often they rang to summon them to punishment. In cobbled squares, under gray skies, men and women became lessons in agony, their bodies twisted into grotesque sermons against lust. The crowd gathered, children perched on shoulders, priests standing solemnly by as the executioner carried out his art. The flames rose, the screams carried on the wind, and the message was clear. Desire is dangerous, and punishment awaits those who cannot master it. But history whispers that behind closed doors even the most pious, the most powerful, were not free of the same temptations. The hypocrisy of kings, bishops, and nobles only deepens the tragedy, for they condemned in others what they indulged in secret. The Middle Ages, for all its grandeur and piety, was a theater of contradictions, where chastity was preached, but obsession ruled, where lust was condemned, but endlessly described, where punishments were designed not only to terrify but to titillate. And so, In the silence of ruined castles and forgotten courtyards, the echoes remain. The Middle Ages has passed, its iron devices rusted, its laws crumbled into dust. Yet the legacy of those twisted sexual punishments endures, a haunting reminder of what happens when fear of desire turns into cruelty, when morality becomes spectacle, and when the human body itself is turned into a stage for suffering. The story is not only history, it is a mirror, showing us how easily power can disguise its obsessions as justice, and how the darkest punishments reveal not the sins of the accused, but the hidden desires of those who punish. The echoes of iron chains, the smell of scorched flesh, the bitter taste of fear on the tongue. These sensations were not isolated moments in the Middle Ages. They were woven into daily life, stitched into the very fabric of a society that insisted on controlling desire through terror. To walk the narrow streets of a medieval town was to live under the shadow of punishments that could erupt at any moment. The boundaries between private longing and public disgrace were fragile, and the wrong whisper, the wrong glance, the wrong accusation could drag a person from the safety of home to the humiliation of the scaffold. One of the most haunting aspects of these punishments was their ritualistic precision. Each act of cruelty was deliberate, calculated to strike not only the flesh but the soul. In some places, adulterers were forced to walk hand in hand, stripped to their undergarments through markets and squares while townsfolk hurled ashes, mud, and dung at them. This humiliation was no accident. It was crafted to corrode the spirit, to make a spectacle of shame so powerful that even the innocent would tremble at the thought of ever being accused. Their suffering became a sermon, written not in words but in agony, and the punishments themselves evolved into grotesque symbols of control. In parts of Italy, men accused of promiscuity were sometimes forced to wear mock phalluses made of wood or leather, grotesque caricatures of their desires, strapped to their bodies as they stumbled through jeering crowds. These punishments blurred humiliation with carnival, turning the most intimate aspects of a person into public theater. It was cruelty masked as moral instruction, but at its core, it was obsession. Society forcing its gaze onto what it most feared and desired. The medieval mind was saturated with symbolism, and nowhere was this more evident than in the punishments tied to sexuality. Fire, the great purifier, was the chosen fate for those accused of sodomy or witchcraft. Flesh burned before the eyes of the crowd was said to cleanse not only the sinner, but the community itself, as though pain and smoke could drive away invisible demons. Water, too, became an instrument of torment. Women accused of lust or infidelity were sometimes subjected to trial by water, stripped and cast into rivers or ponds. If they floated, it was proof of guilt, the water rejecting their sinful bodies. If they sank, innocence was granted, though often at the cost of drowning. Either way, the body became a vessel of truth, its fate decided not by reason but by superstition dressed as justice. For women in particular, sexuality was a double-edged curse. They were branded as temptresses, their very existence said to lure men into sin, yet punished mercilessly for yielding to the same desires society projected onto them. The Virgin Mary was held up as the impossible ideal, a symbol of purity beyond human reach, and any woman who fell short of this unattainable model risked being condemned as a whore or a witch. Their punishments were shaped to target femininity itself. Shorn hair, stripped clothing, exposed flesh. The body was treated as the root of sin, and therefore it had to be the stage of its own undoing. The cruelty of these punishments was magnified by their public nature. To stand before a crowd, naked or bound, one's body violated or scarred, was not just a sentence. It was a death of dignity, a destruction of the self long before the body was consumed. The jeering voices of neighbors, the mocking laughter of strangers, the spit and stones hurled by children, all became part of the punishment. The community itself was weaponized, transformed into executioner, judge, and audience all at once. In this way, the punishment did not end with the body. It lingered in memory, in whispers, in the way others' eyes would forever see the condemned. And yet, in the shadows of monasteries and courts, another truth stirred. Those who judged were often guilty themselves. Chronicles are filled with stories of priests caught in brothels, monks discovered with lovers, kings keeping mistresses in open defiance of their own decrees. The hypocrisy was staggering. The very men who designed instruments of sexual punishment indulged in the sins they condemned, shielded by power and status. Their cruelty toward others was not only control, it was projection, a way of purging their own desires by carving them into the bodies of the powerless. The instruments of torture reveal this twisted psychology with chilling clarity. Consider the pear of anguish, a metal device inserted into the mouth or body and then expanded by turning a screw. Though often mythologized, versions of such devices existed and were linked to sexual crimes. Its symbolism was clear: to silence, to mutilate, to destroy the organ of speech or pleasure. The device embodied the medieval fixation on turning the body itself into the battlefield of morality. Or think of the shame chairs, spiked benches on which the accused were forced to sit naked, every movement piercing the flesh, every second a reminder of their guilt. These were not simply punishments, they were acts of intimate cruelty, designed to linger, to torment not just the body, but the imagination of all who heard of them. Even death could not wash away the stain of sexual sin. Those executed for such crimes were often denied burial in consecrated ground, their ashes scattered, their bones left to rot in ditches or at crossroads. The body, even in death, was treated as polluted, unworthy of rest. In this way, punishment extended beyond life itself, ensuring that shame clung not only to the condemned but to their families, their descendants, their memory. The sheer endurance of these practices reveals how deeply fear of sexuality was rooted in the medieval psyche. Desire was seen as chaos, as danger, as rebellion against divine order. To punish it was to reaffirm control, to reassert the supremacy of God and authority. But the paradox remains: the punishments themselves betrayed an obsession far deeper than the sins they targeted. In the very act of condemning lust, medieval society created rituals soaked in it, rituals that forced eyes, hands, and imaginations upon the flesh they claimed to despise. Walk now, in imagination, into a medieval square. The air is cold, heavy with smoke from the blacksmith's forge. A crowd gathers, murmuring, pressing closer, eyes hungry for spectacle. At the center, a woman kneels, her hair shorn, her shoulders bare. Iron clamps bite into her wrists. She is guilty of lust, the priest says, guilty of tempting men. The executioner steps forward with an iron mask, its jaws spiked, its edges cruel. As it is forced over her face, the crowd gasps, then laughs, then falls silent as the priest raises his hand in blessing. The woman's body trembles, her breath ragged behind the iron, her eyes staring out in terror. In this moment, punishment becomes theater. Cruelty becomes liturgy, and the human body becomes a text upon which fear is written. This was the reality of the Middle Ages, a society that could not look away from sex, that sought to master it through horror, that turned private desire into public execution. The twisted sexual punishments of the era are not just relics of a brutal past. They are mirrors, reflecting humanity's dangerous tendency to disguise obsession as morality and cruelty as justice. And still, even after centuries, the silence of those punished lingers. Their voices were crushed by iron, their cries lost in the roar of fire, their bodies reduced to ash. But their suffering remains, a shadow in history's memory, reminding us of the darkness that arises when fear of the body is allowed to rule.